Hello, everyone at the Rebel Book Club. Hi, Ben. So, apologies for the delay in getting this video to you. In my defense, I did record this entire thing for 23 minutes and managed to screw up the file, so I'm re-recording it. That is how much I adore you guys. And by the way, I'm wearing my you can see in Latin, one north Libro Clava. This is the Singapore Book Club because we're located 1 degree north latitude. And here in Mandarin, which I cannot read, it says something like a book is your friend. So anyway, great to be with you, and let me answer the brilliant questions that you wrote up here. We'll start with Kate's question. Some argue that restrictive immigration policies in rich nations are unethical and economically counterproductive. What's your view on how open national borders should be? So, if you could take all those countries that you're generally referring to and kind of put them in one bucket, then let's break down the answer according to the ethical side and the economic side of it. We'll start with the economic side. Generally speaking, yes, immigration has proven to be an economic benefit. So, for example, the U.S. economy this year or last year demonstrated pretty strong growth, and most economists attribute it to the fact that you got a huge amount, a surge in both legal and illegal immigration, whereas countries that have been low immigration have been growing very slow, very, very slow. Crazy enough, Germany, which has had high immigration, is still barely growing. So just imagine how much of a recession Germany would be in if it hadn't at least had high immigration. So that's the economic piece of it. But the ethical side is a bit more complicated because it's a two-way street. Sure, on the one hand, we may have like a cosmopolitan, obligation to bring in strangers, refugees, asylum seekers, migrants of all kinds. But on the other hand, there's also the domestic population. And countries that don't balance the needs and the concerns, cultural or otherwise, of the local population are going to wind up having the kind of political backlash that you're seeing in Europe. So we can't treat the ethical question as just a one-way street, as a blanket thing. Open borders are better. I'm very often associated with that view that, we should have a borderless world. It's literally not the way it's going to work. I actually believe that you have to do these things in moderation, because if you don't, you won't get that balance right, and you'll wind up having borders closed rather than open. Okay, so to Dinesh's question, it appears that we're going to try and control the movement of people from particular fright that needs to be coordinated at a global level. However, every country's leaders are focused on their local challenges. So this is a great question, but let's remember one thing. Of all the issues that are governed internationally, it could be the economy and trade and finance and capital flows and trying to stem climate change. The one thing that is not globally regulated, and it never, ever will be, is migration, because it is that final vestige of sovereignty that said, where governments say, if nothing else, I can't control pollution or cybercrime and hacking, drugs, all of these things coming across my borders, but I'll be damned if I will let anyone else restrict my right to control my border against the movement of people, other human beings. So you will never have central coordination. Ever, 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 ever. I could say it 1,000 times, sadly, because this issue does deserve to have some kind of global coordination, given what a big deal it is. But it's not going to happen. It can be that countries may learn from each other, and they'll say, oh, wow, I prefer to be like Canada. Canada's letting lots of people in, and it's assimilating them, and it's growing their economy. I wish my policy were more like Canada's. Can I learn from Canada? But no one is going to force Italy to be like Canada. Italy's going to have to wake up one day and realize that it would have been better off having a policy like Canada's. And again, every country has its own peculiar circumstances culturally to make its decisions about whether or not it's going to allow what numbers of migrants. That said, what I like to do is to kind of look at much more what countries do and what the numbers are than what politicians say. And it turns out that even when you have hyper-nationalist or xenophobic, protectionist, anti-immigrant governments, guess what? The immigration numbers just keep going up anyway, because supply and demand, going back to Kate's economic question, supply and demand tends to dictate immigration reality much more than parochial xenophobic politics do. Otherwise, you wouldn't have these numbers of migrants growing as quickly as they are. Mandeep asked, what are some of the most innovative ideas you've seen aimed at better integrating immigrants into host society? So let me give you two answers. One is actually just around the fact that since there's no central coordination, what do smart countries do? Well, they say they do what are called skills transfer partnership agreements. And that's a, a kind of acronym or term for when one country says, okay, we have a labor shortage, we need 50,000 nurses a year. So Japan goes out, calls up the Philippines and says, Philippines, please, can you make sure you train 50,000 nurses a year just for us? They may go to Dubai also, they may go to Singapore, they may go to America, they may go to Spain, but please save 50,000 for us every single year. Taiwan has done this with India for IT programmers. Greece has just asked India to provide agricultural workers, construction workers, and so on. So you have these bilateral agreements all the time between countries, and that is a really good example of making it supply and demand based, doing it in a strategic way based on policy, and making it less political. So I think that's a good thing. But I think the question you were actually asking is much more around assimilation policy within the country once migrants are there. So let me answer that. And there, I think if there's a silver bullet, there isn't a silver bullet, but if there were a silver bullet, it would be language. I've lived through this myself, having, moved to the US when I was young and learned English, then moved to Germany when I was a teenager, German. And I saw just this, this swirl of, Turks and Arabs and other populations, ethnic groups in Germany who never really assimilated because they didn't learn German. And today in Europe, you could actually create a nice typology of countries that have language requirements for migrants and those that don't have language requirements, and then the degree of assimilation and the unemployment rates and other kinds of variables correlated to whether or not there's language requirement. And what you'll find, it's no surprise in a way, is that those countries that have the language requirement are going to have higher degrees of assimilation, lower rates of unemployment, and those kinds of things among those ethnic groups. There may be exceptions, but generally speaking, that's what you'll see. So truly, 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 it must be language. You can get so many other things wrong, like America, but just get language right. Just make sure people learn English, or in the case, whatever country you're in, right? Learn that language. That's going to be absolutely crucial. And I do think, though, that more broadly, more social spending needs to go towards assimilation, and assimilation needs to be viewed as not just some kind of fringe social spend, but a strategic national priority to maintain cohesion itself. And if we think of it as not just something that we kind of have to do because all these people are here and it's a big drain on expenditure, but rather say, oh my goodness, if we were to spend more money strategically and train them all in our language, then they'd be skilled and could contribute to the economy and grow our economy. That would be a small down payment on a much larger payout in the future. Climate change, Max's question, is expected to displace millions of people. How can we prepare? Yes. So, of course, that's the thrust of a lot of my work. And it's not just millions, it could be over 1 billion people. It's already hundreds of millions, after all. According to the International Organization of Migration, 1/3 of all displaced people today are accounted for by climate change. So how can we prepare? Again, I ask, who's the we, right? It's sort of, it's all done at a local level, bottom up, right? There are climate migrants in Africa who just stay within an African country or within their region. No country receives more climate migrants than America because they're from the Caribbean, and it's tens of thousands or more every single year. They don't call them climate migrants, but that's exactly what they are. They're coming from Central America. This huge bottleneck or flow of migrants from Central America through Mexico to the United States are partially climate migrants too. So whatever you want to call it, it's a big driver and it's everywhere all the time. But the way the US deals with it versus Europe versus other Arab countries in the Middle East and so forth are always going to be different. How can we prepare? Well, again, to me, the countries that are climate resilient inherently and have labor shortages should be thinking about how they can recruit those migrants and put them to work in ways that more readily adapt their infrastructure and housing and so forth to those migrant populations. One of the things I've learned is that, you can't avoid it. They're going to come. They're going to come, and you can really map out the exact vectors because you can look at where there's climate stress, where there's climate resilience, how close they are to each other, and pretty much plot where people are going to move. So I've been looking at places like Eastern Turkey. Turkey has the largest refugee population in the entire world, and it doesn't want to have any of them, but it does. And a lot of them, and a lot more, are coming from places like Iran or Syria or Iraq, Jordan. Look at these countries that are adjacent or almost adjacent to Turkey, to its southeast and west, and southeast and east. These are some of those climate stressed countries in the world. You cannot possibly pretend that just because there's a border between Turkey and Iran, Turkey and Iraq, and Afghanistan not that far away, that you're not going to have tens of millions of more climate migrants in eastern Turkey. Of course you will. So you have to work with those host governments and subsidize them, do multilateral joint investment projects with them, so that those people can be absorbed rather than just kind of being permanently stateless. Okay, Ben's question. Is it right for unelected bodies like the World Economic Forum to advance their own ideological interests for guiding and influencing the political decision-making in multiple nations, rather than allowing governments to make independent decisions? So multilateralism, whether it's formal bodies like the UN or informal bodies like the World Economic Forum, don't actually influence our national decision-making as much as we blame them, as doing. And we scapegoat them very often. So Trump did this all the time. Boris Johnson did this with the EU. It's always the unelected technocrats out there forcing us to do things. The truth is, a democratic sovereign country makes its own decisions, and its informed electorate and citizenry can and should speak up and be informed and not allow their governments to sell out to those, call it corporatized, call it technocratic, whatever, derisive term you want to use, shouldn't sell out to them if it doesn't believe those policies are good. But there really is not a conspiracy out there of this, very coordinated and secretive group of multilateral institutions and their leaders who are dictating policy to governments. There happen to be like-minded people who want to see certain things happen, but it is within your right and prerogative as the citizens of the UK or any other country to withdraw from those institutions, right? To reverse those recommendations, because they're often not binding, right, at all. So I think we often ascribe way too much power to them. Again, Republican governments in the US do this with like NAFTA and the World Trade Organization all the time. It's been demonstrated over and over that by and large, membership in those groups helps you, not hurts you. Alice's question: do we think we'll see more digital nomads, global citizens, and yes, national allegiance? How will tax work? Great questions. Big theme in the book, obviously. Digital nomads, yes. Before COVID, you had like 5 countries with digital nomad schemes. Today, they're like 100. Again, was it coordinated? Not at all. No one said in the year 2022, okay, COVID's over, everyone, you can now declare a migrant, global golden visa scheme and a digital nomad scheme and welcome everyone in. No one said you had to do it. Every country realized it's better to have people than not have people, especially after 2 years of not having people. And so everyone saw everyone else doing it and just did it. And that's the beautiful thing about these learning effects. So now everyone's got digital nomad schemes and golden visa schemes and more people identifying as global citizens and remote workers. And this builds on the trend towards less national allegiance, because as you saw in the book, I talk a lot about generational identity, millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, whose identity is formed more horizontally through technology and social media than vertically inherited from their parents and grandparents. So I think that all of these things are reinforcing each other. Taxation is going to be something that's much more like, tied to you, the person, and what you do where you are rather than your country, because so many people, especially, there's only a couple of countries that have global taxation like the US. Most other countries, it's sort of the service that you render when you're there. So you'll see a rise in like value-added tax, goods and services tax, consumption taxes, because governments will want to capture your spending when you're there. But if you spend 10 days here and 10 days there and 10 days there for 36 different, periods of the year, then, everyone's going to want to have their cut in each of those increments of time wherever you are. And so I imagine that you'll just be spending more locally in order for governments to capture what they can, but you will otherwise not be taxed all that much. Your company, your employer, if you have one, but more and more people are self-employed, especially young people, like the rate of self-employment is going way up. And everyone being like a self-employed nomad, what's the tax system? Well, there'll be one, right? But there'll be common practices around where is your firm incorporated, and whatever that jurisdiction is, you pay a little bit more there, those kinds of things. But it'll be a hodgepodge, but most certainly it'll be a lot more digital. And hopefully you won't have to count your days as much in the future, or at least let someone else count your days for you. Last question was from Johnny. How might automation and AI affect global migration patterns by reducing labor needs in some fields, but creating new workforce demands? So that's exactly what's going on. It's push and it's pull. So, one of the areas where jobs are being created is education, right? Robots aren't teaching our kids as much as humans are. So, being a English teacher abroad is still a growth industry, for example. Construction is not yet done by robots either, right? So, construction work is still proliferating around the world. But of course, if you take just, back office call centers, look at India. Like in India, you've got an economy or a demographic bulge that's producing 4 or 5 million new college graduates or technical graduates a year, and they need jobs, but only 1 million new jobs are being created. And now you've got AI displacing the people who were getting jobs in call centers. So on the one hand, it's like, oh, well, I'll definitely, graduated from Technical Institute in India. I want to work in a call center. I can't get a job there because the AI is doing it. So now I'm going to look for a job abroad. So joblessness in one place creates the demand for people to leave and go get jobs where jobs are being created for humans. You've got that kind of dynamic. And then, of course, let's say you work in a factory and the factory's closed because it's been outsourced or automated. Well, then you're also going to physically move to another place, maybe in the same country or not, where jobs are being created. So the Rust Belt phenomenon in America, since the 70s, 80s, 90s, jobs were lost in Michigan, Ohio, and elsewhere. People moved south to the Sun Belt states, right? From the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt, because taxes were low, jobs were being created, the economy was growing. But now, by the way, because of climate, people will start to move back from south to north. You're seeing people trying to sell their homes in Florida because insurance premiums are rising, and they're moving to places like North Carolina, where lots of jobs are being created. So, in conclusion, when I wrote the book, I called it Move, but I kind of learned along the way that I should have called it Moving. Because consistent with the idea of being more nomadic, there isn't really one end goal. And I thought at the beginning of the project that I would identify that, one set of vectors. People will move from place A to place B and place X to place Y. And then I realized that really there will be more and more circulation. And people, if you have the luxury of doing so, the optionality to do so, there will be more kind of mobility, right, of people rather than just one destination. And that certainly applies to those who don't know where their job is going to be next week or next year. So when I look at the US market, I look at young people. I advocated in the book that people buy trailer homes because, young millennials, there have been a lot of surveys of this, of buyer's remorse. Like they regret having bought a house in state X and town Y because like, oh my God, I bought this house and I've got a mortgage and I thought I was going to have this job here. Then I lost my job, or, interest rates have gone up, so I can't even afford the mortgage anymore. And then there's climate risk. I didn't factor in maintenance costs. I wish I'd never bought this house. And I'm thinking, well, young people today don't even have kids. They might as well live in trailers and get a Starlink and drive around, and wherever they're working, go and work there. And therefore they can have a, kind of a mechanical nomadism. And I know that is a bit sort of like, it's not going to work for everyone. But I do think that actually more and more people are doing it. I didn't invent the idea at all. I call it mobile real estate. My term is mobile real estate, but I've seen the data literally. Actually, in fact, REITs, meaning like real estate developments that are securitized into financial products like for trailer parks, are one of the fastest growing asset classes in real estate in America, because so many people are just organically deciding to do this. Again, it's not going to be for 300 million people. It's not going to be for 50 million people in the UK or elsewhere. But it's just a symbol of how everyone's going to find their own solution, to this challenge. And AI will mean that either you have to leave where you are because there's just no jobs, it's all been automated, or it's going to be that you can choose to be anywhere and be, sort of the skilled software programmer or whatever the case may be. So those are just a few kind of thoughts and replies to your questions. And thank you again for having me join. Hope you have a great follow-on set of discussions, and hope I'll get to join you in person one day. Take care. Bye.